All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We are here tonight to have this discussion about the film Still I Rise. My name is Katie Bramell. I am the Director of Museum Experiences here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And on behalf of our board, staff, and volunteers, I would like to welcome you to tonight's film discussion. Before we get started, I would like to give a quick shout out to our members and thank them for their support, and to all of you who have supported us, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. It is because of support from you that we have been able to provide wonderful programming initiatives such as the discussion you are about to see tonight. All right, and then just hold on 1 second. Okay. So at this point, I would like to just go ahead and jump on in and introduce you to tonight's panelist. We are joined here tonight by Sheri Schuster. Sheri is a documentary film director and producer interested in advancing intersectional and moral conversations about race and power. An Iranian American and LA native, her commitment to human rights drew her into the world of public policy and storytelling. For over 15 years, Sheri worked with nonprofits and elected officials as a communications and fund development director, including former U.S. Congressman Tom Lantos and the Center for Women and Democracy. From 2008 to 2012, she served as the associate director at Covenant House, California, advocating for homeless and sex-trafficked youth. Sheri is an alumnus of UCLA and the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. Sheri is thrilled to be in partnership with Holly Joshi on her newest venture, All In for Justice. Joshi, thank you, sorry. I asked her before too. But yes, thank you for being with us here tonight, Sheri.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting Holly and I to join you. We're both really excited to be here and are really to be just proud to be partnering with such an amazing institution.
Great, thank you. And our other panelists, our wonderful panelists will be joined with tonight is Holly Joshi. Holly has been a committed community.
No, it's not Josh. I'm sorry, say it again.
Say it one more time for me, sorry.
Holly, why don't you say it?
Hi, I'm Holly Joshi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So sorry. A committed community servant for 2 decades and leader in the anti-trafficking and gender-based violence movement for over a decade. She currently works as a senior research consultant with Bright Research Group and with communities across the country, developing anti-trafficking prevention and intervention strategies as a national training consultant. She served as the executive director of MISSEY, which stands for Motivating, Inspiring, Supporting, and Serving Sexually Exploited Youth, a youth-serving nonprofit dedicated to providing direct services and advocacy for survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. In addition, she spent 14 years working in the Oakland Police Department, where she served as a child abuse and human trafficking investigator, undercover vice officer, and as the supervisor of the Child Exploitation and Trafficking Unit. In this capacity, she investigated hundreds of cases involving child abuse, intimate partner violence, and commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking, interviewed hundreds of survivors and perpetrators, and posed in an undercover capacity extensively during her trafficking investigations. Holly is a court-qualified expert in commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, pimping, and pandering. Holly was also an invited member of Vice President and then California Attorney General Kamala Harris's Task Force on Human Trafficking and Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and served on the City of Oakland's CSEC Task Force and Alameda County's Trafficking Task Force. Holly holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Criminal Justice from California State University East Bay, a master's degree in leadership for social justice from St. Mary's College of California, and is currently a doctoral candidate in education leadership at St. Mary's College of California. Welcome, Holly.
Hi, thank you for having me, Katie. I'm really excited for today's conversation. Thank you for everyone who's in attendance, taking time out of your day to be here with us in this important conversation.
Yes, and again, thank you guys so much. We're really looking forward to having this conversation. and just to talk a little bit more about this really important film and the work that you guys are doing. Before we jump in though, I'd just like to ask the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of tonight's discussion. All right. Well, if that sounds good with everybody, I'd like to go ahead and start. And the first question I have here is really directed to Sheri. You know, we're here to discuss the documentary film. So can you provide a little bit of background and context as to why you decided to make this film?
Sure. The main inspiration for making the film was the 4 years I spent at Covenant House, California in Oakland. And I really got a chance to get to know and connect with and love on a lot of the youth there. And I was also very fortunate to be mentored by some of the most amazing kick-ass social workers you can imagine. You know, Brian Bob, Brad Kelly, Mariam, just like so many people there that really that loved me and taught me and helped me to connect and helped me to understand the deeper systemic issues at play. I think if it hadn't been for the amazing staff at Covenant House, California in Oakland, I don't know that the movie would have been made. And certainly if I hadn't had the opportunity to really understand how racist so many of the systems involved that the youth that I knew were interfacing with had to deal with. Like, if I hadn't had all of those experiences and witnessed what I witnessed, you know, some things you just can't unsee. And so by the time I was done working at Covenant House after 4 years as an associate director, I just thought to myself, these kids are getting fed to the wolves, not just by their families, not just by society, not just by their neighborhoods, but by juvenile justice, by foster care, by mental health systems. All these systems were failing them. And I kept thinking to myself, like, how is it that these kids are getting in more trouble than most kids, right? So they're having more contact with adults because they're getting, you know, some of them were on probation, some of them were getting expelled from school, some of them were having mandatory meetings with school counselors, some of them were dealing with, you know, the foster care system. So how is it that they were dealing with so many more adults, at least in an official capacity, than the average kid, and yet nobody was like seeing their trauma, and nobody was, I mean, not nobody, I can't say nobody, but very few people inside the system that is supposedly set up to protect them, to nurture them, to help set them up for success. Many of those systems were failing miserably. And so I just thought, like, well, one, why isn't anybody talking about the fact that this is so disproportionately impacting Black girls and women and femmes in California? And like, when I did see the media portrayals that existed, you know, they were, you know, whether it was a film or whether it was news coverage of child sex trafficking, most of the portrayals were just dehumanizing, objectifying, sensationalizing, and all the rest. And I thought, none of these portrayals are centering the lived experience and perspectives and needs as defined by survivors of Black girls and women and femmes. And I just thought, somebody has to do that because their voices deserve to be heard. And so that was the inspiration for the film.
Thank you. Yeah, I think
I have a background in film. My background's in public policy. So like, I had zero background in film. I was just like very tenacious and like confident and was like, you know what, I'm just going to make a film. Because at the time, one of my best friends, Leiden Negrete, who's also a producer on Still I Rise, and just an extraordinary, brilliant human being, she had just made a film. And I was like, wait a minute, you have 2 young kids at home, you're doing a PhD in public policy at UC Berkeley, and you just made a film, and that film just won an Emmy Award for Best Investigative Journalist, and it won film festivals all over the world. It was called Presumed Guilty or Presunto Culpable. It was the highest grossing documentary in Mexican history. And so I just thought, man, I'm lazy. I'm not doing any of this. I gotta go out there and do something. Like, if she can do all of this, like, you know, and be raising 2 kids, I was like, there's got to be more that I can do. And so I picked up a camera and I bought a Mac computer and I was like, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something to really shine a light on the voices and the lived experiences of Black girls and women.
Great. Yeah, I think part of the reason I remember, so, you know, I started at the Freedom Center in the anti-trafficking department, and I remember looking for context that kind of focused on BIPOC communities because, you know, knowing what we know that these type of things, especially with sex trafficking, affect the most vulnerable communities. And I remember that's how I found this film. I found you guys starting the work on it at that time. And that's what I think really drew our institution to this film and to have this conversation, because what I love about it is it really kind of refocuses that lens a little bit on to focus on BIPOC communities, because I think a lot of times some of the general narrative doesn't do that as well.
Yeah, and it's not really on BIPOC communities. It's really specifically about Black girls and women and femmes, you know, and I think that there's an important distinction to be made just in general.
Yeah, no. And I think, so for example, in the film, you know, Leah addresses that some 85% of the individuals she works with identify as Black, and that people would be, quote, horrified by how many people from communities of color have been impacted by human trafficking. So with that in mind, can you both take a moment and kind of discuss why it's so important that we kind of talk about systematic and structural racism when we address human trafficking and issues of sex trafficking?
Yeah, Holly, I feel like I've already like talked a lot, so go ahead. Like, I mean, I'm sure we could both chime in on this, but like,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can jump in. I think it's a really important question. You said that, you know, Leah had mentioned that people may be horrified by how many people from communities of color have been impacted, and I'm not sure that that's the case, right? I mean, I think that I've been in the movement. I grew up in the anti-trafficking movement. I've been in the movement for almost 20 years, and what I've seen is the exact opposite of people being horrified once they understand the demographics. I remember one time, you know, working with another advocate who had invited me to be a keynote speaker. And right before we walked into the event, she told me, Holly, please don't do your Black girls and girls of color speech, because these women are women from the hills and they're mostly white, and they need to feel like this issue could impact their daughter or her friends. And I want them to give you and your organization money, and they need to believe that it could happen to their daughters or her friends. And so I just want to start with that and say that, you know, the anti-trafficking movement has really moved over this past 20 years in a very colorblind manner. And that's obviously not working for us, right? I mean, the anti-trafficking movement, the history of the colorblind kind of feminist work in America, early feminist work, is very similar to what anti-trafficking has been in this past 20 years. And what Sheri and I and many other women of color and activists and advocates in the work are trying to do is to move it towards a centered conversation about who is most marginalized, right? And we can't be disconnected from other critical movement work as if trafficking itself is the problem, right? Like trafficking is a symptom. We understand that trafficking is a symptom of the larger historical and ongoing oppressions impacting women and girls and young people of color, but particularly Black women and girls who clearly, you know, as we talk about in the film, came to this country through a transatlantic slave trade. And so the movie does a really great job of weaving that narrative together and trying to get us as society to face the truth, which is that Black women and girls have always been bought and sold in this country and haven't ever been seen as true victims of sexual atrocities or oppressions against their bodies, right? And for so long, the trafficking movement has been heavily influenced and in some spaces completely controlled by carceral system actors. So police, district attorneys, and advocates without experiential understanding of the issues. And we know that who controls the narrative controls the definition of the problem, right? And whoever controls the definition of the problem controls the proposed solutions and the resources. So system-centered conversations focused on crime and punishment and arrest and control as the way to safety is not in alignment with the perspectives of many, many survivors, particularly survivors of color. A system-centered conversation is not survivor-centered. And so we often hear, community-based organizations and social service providers talking about programs being survivor-centered, but really there's a critical need, particularly now in this current conversation about reimagining public safety and reimagining community health, to center survivors in those larger conversations about what true community health and safety and justice looks like. So we are, really wanting to do our work in partnership with other advocates, organizers, academics, co-conspirators, committed to connecting this work, this anti-trafficking work, with the overall movement for Black lives, because at its core, it's a human rights issue, right? It's a denial of Black girls' full humanity. We're talking about children. The average age of entry is 12 to 14 years old. And so as Audre Lorde told us, as Dr. Crenshaw has taught us, is, there's no thing as a single issue person. And so we can't live single issue struggles, right? And so what we're really trying to do through the film and through our work is to engage in intersectional movement.
Amen.
Thank you for that. To kind of piggyback off that a little bit, Holly, from your experience with the criminal justice system, how, in your opinion, can we use the system, as Dr. Crenshaw mentions in the film, to protect exploited girls without criminalizing them?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question and really difficult. I think, the current system as it stands is highly flawed and in many, many instances harmful, right? And the current conversation about defund is really a call to reallocate resources to community and to community-based prevention and intervention solutions, which I support. I also recognize that it's complex and that even calls and plans to reduce police budgets by 50% still leave us with the other 50%. Right? Which means that we're going to have to do reimagining and reform work at the same time. And so the reform work, it must focus on policy and practice, yes, but at the highest level, systems are made up of people, and interrupting the mental models and worldviews of system actors is one of the highest forms of systems change. So when it comes to trafficking, that means that the system has to recognize Black women and girls as vulnerable, as capable of being victimized. Systems have racialized responses to victimization all the time. I mean, we see often and currently all over the news that systems have racialized responses to calls for service and racialized responses to people being accused of crimes. But systems also have racialized responses to victimization. And what I've seen most often in the anti-trafficking movement is the adultification of Black girls. That's a foundational issue to the anti-trafficking movement. I'll lean into the research and report by Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. They discuss the erasure of Black girlhood in America. They gather data, showing how US adults view Black girls. And what we all know, what Black girls know from our experiential understanding growing up in this country is what the data showed. And that is that Americans perceive Black girls as early as age 5 to be less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers. They believe that Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, less supports, less comfort. They believe that Black girls are more independent and know more about adult topics, and specifically more about sex than their white peers. So the implications are significant, particularly when we're talking about trafficking, right? And I've seen this play out in real world, day-to-day scenarios and system interactions and responses to Black girls consistently over the years of doing the work. It comes out in discrepancies and decisions about what's going on, deciding who's being cooperative or not, who's in need of protection, which often dictates a carceral system response. And those are all racialized. And so I'll stop there, but I think that any attempt to create a system that is not harmful to trafficked survivors has to center this racial reckoning and this very real issue of racialized response to victimhood.
Great. Sheri, this film puts in, again, this great content with the Women's March, and you pull from, protests circling around the Me Too movement and so other social justice protests with a specific and intentional emphasis on the Black Lives Matter movement. I think the answer to this question really has already happened, but I mean, why do you feel like it was so important to kind of refocus and devote so much of the film to this conversation and to include those footages and that conversation?
I mean, if you've seen the film, like, how could I not put Patrisse Cullors and Tamika Mallory and Tarana Burke and, Angela Davis and Kimberly Crenshaw and Janelle Monáe and Alicia Keys and Gabrielle Union and Jada Pinkett Smith and all the women that are in the film are in the film because they've been in the movement work. They've been fighting for racial and gender justice for years, if not decades, if not multiple decades. And so I just felt like the film wouldn't be complete if we weren't also connecting all of the dots and really paying homage to folks like Patrisse Cullors and like Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And yeah, I mean, have you seen Tamika Mallory? Like, she's just amazing. She's, she's incredible. Like, all of these women, like, were just so inspirational to me, Tarana Burke, Alicia Keys, all of these women are just outstanding. And I really felt like I owed a debt of gratitude to them and all of the other, Black feminists that have influenced my thinking, including, Bell Hooks, including Nikki Jones, including Holly, including Leah, including Kianga Yamata Taylor, including Abraham Kendi, including Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, there's so much brilliance out there today. It's just kind of, I just felt like I would be remiss if I wasn't highlighting like the entire squad, and on that note, if you haven't already read it, Nikki Jones was also one of the advisors to our film. And so, yeah, we're grateful to all the people's, all the folks' shoulders that we're standing on top of, and there are many.
Yeah, and I think we're getting a couple of questions about this, and I want to, I'll mention this at the end too, but if you haven't seen the film, obviously definitely encourage you to watch it because it's so powerful in its entirety, and it's available on stillirisethefilm.com. So, that's available to watch at any time. So please incorporate that into your weekend or your plans in the future. This next question, I'm really want you guys to, talk a little bit more about, you're obviously incredibly passionate for this work. Can you tell us about the moment each of you had the realization that you wanted to dedicate your life to this mission and to sharing these experiences and these stories?
Once I realized that the vast majority of young women were Black women and girls and femmes, including LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth of color. Once I realized that these were the majority of young people that were being exploited and raped and sold, and that by contrast, the majority of sex buyers, the majority of exploiters are white men. And so that means These are your colleagues. These are your neighbors. These are your doctors. These are your lawyers. These are your professors. These are your clergymen. These are your rabbis. These are your politicians for sure. And, 16% of men in the United States have paid for sex. And that's a stat according to Demand Abolition. And, most, like 85% of men on the internet who are buying sex are white men. So is it a mystery that most of the women that are being exploited are Black women and most of the men that are doing the purchasing are white, and then this is operating in some, just colorblind way? I don't think so. And so, when I read that in 2017, there was a study that was done that showed that, for example, in Minnesota, it's a pretty white state, they found that the majority of buyers, sex buyers, exploiters rather, the majority of exploiters in that state are white, middle to upper class, married. Yes, married men. That means women in Minnesota, you should be maybe having some conversations with your husbands. Just saying.
Sheri,
Mhm.
I love you, girl. Okay.
It's always like, I can't with you, girl. I can't.
Yeah, Katie, as I was saying earlier, my history, it's been a long time, right? I've been involved in the anti-trafficking work for almost 20 years and I've had longevity in the work by just really kind of switching my position in it. You know how burnout happens and when you're working in such a traumatic field. So I've done investigations, I've done policy work, I've done direct services. But to your earlier point about how we decided that this was going to be kind of our life's work, is I was working as an undercover officer in Oakland during an undercover investigation. And I had been an undercover officer at that point for a few years, but I was really focused on, and I was very young, and I was very focused on interrupting violent crime in the community that I'd grown up in. So trying to interrupt, guns being bought and sold in the city and all of those types of things. So this day I wasn't even scheduled to work on an undercover, quote unquote prostitution detail, as that's what we were calling it way back then. But I was walking through the hallway and this sergeant stopped me and was like, hey, you've been to the undercover school and we need an undercover female to work tonight. And if you don't do it, then this other, woman is going to have to go stand out on International Boulevard by herself. And you know how dangerous that is. So I really did it as a favor to this other female police officer, because at that time there were probably only 4 female police officers in the entire city of Oakland that had undercover training and experience. So I was going to go stand on International Boulevard to support them in this undercover operation just for the night. But when I went out there and I stood on International Boulevard, right, and I grew up in Oakland, so I was used to going up and down the same street. It just was life-changing, and it was really career-changing because, number one, it was the first time, honestly, in my career that I was scared, because it was just the violence in which the exploiters were running the track was really palpable. And then about 4 hours into my shift, I looked across the street and I saw a 15-year-old girl standing across the street. And so in that moment, I thought, this is an act. I'm pretending. I have a gun under my mini skirt and a wire, and there's 20 cops around the corner ready to back me up anytime I say something is going wrong. And I'm not really getting into cars with these men. And across the street is a little girl, and this is her real life. It was absolutely the defining moment of my career, in which I didn't care, honestly, about much anything else. And so I started just investigating, like, what's happening in the city that I grew up in with girls and women that look like me. And that was, 20 years ago.
Thank you guys for sharing that with us. One point too that I kind of wanted to focus on that I think is really important. Leah in the film mentions the use of specific terms like victim in the film, and Holly, you address the use of the language around trafficking as well. So how does the way we craft our words impact survivors and their community? And how can reframing the narrative make a difference to traffickers, the survivors, the public, and our policymakers?
Yeah, words mean things, as my friend Anat Shanker Osario likes to say. Words mean things. And so framing is extremely important. If you read any George Lakoff or any of these other cognitive linguistics who focus specifically on framing, the way we frame the problem oftentimes also defines the way we frame the solutions. And so language is super important. And oftentimes, like Holly said, you know, victimhood is very racially coded, and there is no such thing as a child prostitute. So using that language only serves to reinforce and dehumanize children. And yeah, language is super important. And that's part of why Holly and I are launching a new venture called All In for Justice. And one prong of our future work is going to be training the media on how to use appropriate framing and ethical language, and to be able to create multidimensional and compassionate and accurate perceptions of girls and women and femmes who may have lived experience with human trafficking.
Thanks, Sheri. The only thing I would add to that is that making the film, you know, has really given me a new appreciation of art and storytelling as critical to social change efforts. Like, I'd been doing the work already for 15 years before I engaged in the filmmaking part, right? And at the time that I came in contact with Sheri in the film, I thought I'd given up on the media or the cameras as a medium to communicate about trafficking, because they were really wanting to focus on the salacious aspect of the story. You know, they were wanting to see a police arrest. They were wanting to see a Black or brown man in handcuffs. They weren't wanting to really talk about root causes and solutions. And so, you know, to Sheri's point, I think that there's a reason why, when we look back in history, every social, political, you know, racial justice movement has included art and narrative. And it's not just because art's pretty or it makes us feel a kind of way. It's because it's specifically consciousness raising work, and narrative work is political, right? Because politics is largely a fight over ideology. And so, as
Mhm,
we said, it's like, who gets to influence the way we think about and understand what is happening in the world, to who and why
mhm,
definitely influences what the solutions are. And then the only other thing I would say is that language and narrative change work is critical for healing, for survivors, and for marginalized people, because it's a question of internalized oppression and what stories we believe about ourselves and our people, right? I mean, Du Bois talked about this a long time ago. It's like double consciousness and seeing ourselves through the eyes of the oppressor. You know, James Baldwin said that the most insidious form of racism is believing what they say about you. And so
mhm,
internal narrative is a huge challenge in the work with trafficked girls. There's society's narrative, there's the exploiter's narrative about who they are, and, you know, the systems narrative, powerful people in powerful systems, child welfare, social services, schools, churches. There's healing power in political education and narrative change work, because when we take the conversation from a micro level, and what I mean by a micro level is victim blaming. You
mhm,
made bad choices, or blaming the victim's family. Your family is dysfunctional, and that's why you ended up in this situation. When we take it to a macro level and we talk about society has set up entire groups of people to be victimized, then we see our circumstances anew. And so, in relation to working with survivors, when we provide the space and support to begin to interrogate what we've heard about our situation, about our bad choices, about our bad families as the reason for our exploitation and oppression, then we begin to see that it's all a setup, right? That we weren't meant to thrive. We were brought here being bought and sold. And that awareness can be healing, right? That awareness turns into activism. And that activism and political movement for people of color is healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's, you know, just another, like, sometimes often not discussed part of the importance of narrative change work that I really wanted us to ground in and to uplift today.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And a lot of that is informed by what we see in the media and what friends and people that we love and respect and admire reflect back to us. And so if all the stories you know about yourself are like make you feel ugly or make you feel unwanted, make you feel disposable, make you feel small, I mean, that's a big part of the reason why I made the film, and not just why I made it, but why I made it the way I made it, because I wanted to be able to hold up a loving, beautiful, compassionate, like soulful, humanizing, empowering lens to the women involved in the film. And that, you know, and I hope I was able to do that for both Leah and for Holly and for Professor Crenshaw and for all the other, you know, all the other women that were in the film because of their activism, because of their, you know, amazing work in anti-racist and gender-based violence work.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you mentioned it, do you guys want to talk a little bit about this All In for Justice initiative that you guys are launching, or can you share any more details about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think Holly and I are both like well aware that um, this past couple of years has brought us to a unique time in history and some unique opportunities. And, you know, we see a lot of the equity movements, including the movement for Black Lives and the anti-trafficking movement and Me Too and Say Her Name. We see all of these things starting to really intersect and overlap, and for movement work to start to be like very, I guess, maybe just intersectional, and also like with that comes an increased political will, and I think just a heightened sense of public consciousness about how much fuckery has happened in this country because of racism. And so All In for Justice is our vision, it's our work really to respond to the times. You know, Nina Simone said, I think something to the extent of like, how can you be an artist and not reflect the times? And so that's really what we're trying to do, is reflect the times that we're already in and continue to build and strengthen our partnerships, like with the media, with organizations like Freedom Center, with the African American Policy Center, with Intersectionality Matters, which is a podcast that we're going to be on in the next coming weeks, thanks to Kim Crenshaw and the amazing staff at the African American Policy Forum. And so we want to continue to facilitate, you know, community and educational screenings, and really use Still I Rise as a launching point for more conversations, for more narrative change, for more consciousness lifting, for policy change, you know, for legislative change, and also very importantly to really educate the media. I mean, Holly and I have both been on, you know, various like interviews with the radio and news and this and that, and it's just obnoxious how many times I've had to bite my tongue because of the way that journalists have framed the issue. It's just, I've had to just sometimes just walk off set and think to myself, do people hear themselves when they talk? Like, do people hear themselves when they say things? Because yeah, I've just had to, and this is as an Iranian American Jewish woman who is not Black and still is listening to other people talk to me about Black women and girls in um, such a dehumanizing and desensitized way. It's just, I mean, it's sad. It's really sad. It's sad, and it's enraging, and it's many things, you know. And so the work that Holly and I want to continue to do at All In for Justice, which you can actually go to on our website, stillirisethefilm.com, all one word, Still I Rise. And there is now a tab that says All In for Justice. So you can look at All In for Justice and see the type of work we're doing, see what our what our mission is, and also to be in contact for those of you who are interested in collaboration and partnership with Holly and I, because we're just launching this now, and we need the support and the love of our community, and we need funding from our community, and we need support from foundations, and we need support from individual donors, and we need support from giving circles and all the rest. So if you are somebody out there in the audience tonight who's watching this and is interested in connecting with Holly and I, please, we really welcome, we welcome local partnerships, we welcome national partnerships, and we welcome global partnerships. So for sure, the work we're going to be doing at All In for Justice, we believe that dismantling systemic racism is anti-trafficking work. And so that includes efforts to really support and center Black girls and women's and femmes education, increased safety for Black girls in schools in particular, enhanced access to reproductive health, justice and equity campaigns like Say Her Name, Me Too, and We As Ourselves. And really just centering the lived experiences and voices of Black women, girls, and femmes, and really making sure that they're centered in all conversations and discussions of police violence, and uplifting Black women and girls in media culture as content creators, as performers, as producers and directors, and all the rest. And so that is our vision for All In for Justice. And like I said, we need to partner and collaborate with all the people and all the institutions and all the funders and all the foundations that believe in this work and that really want to put their money where their mouth is. So
Great. No, thank you for sharing that with us.
I'm sorry, no, I don't have anything to add.
One question I did want to ask is, this documentary focused mainly on Oakland and the San Francisco Bay Area, but can you talk to us about the similarities and differences in local, state, national, and international policies and practices, or even maybe how we should be thinking about? Obviously, as you said, white supremacy is rooted into it, so that's a good, piece to incorporate. And I say this to say, I'll just mention too, Ohio is 5th in the nation for human trafficking. So, we're in Cincinnati, our region's kind of in the thick of it in the Midwest here too. So this is definitely something that is of a regional interest to combat.
Yeah, Holly's an expert on this. She's trained law enforcement and police departments and the DOJ and the military and folks all over the country. And so I think, Holly, you'd probably be best equipped to answer this, because this is really like part of your, part of the many expertise that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to answer it, quickly and concisely, just because I think it's a really, it could be a whole conversation on its own. And yeah, I've been all over the country training law enforcement and social services. One of the things I think is most important for us to know is, as you mentioned, Katie, Ohio is, in the top 5, California is, always number 1 or number 2, Texas, the San Francisco Bay Area region, Los Angeles, all of these places that are identified as, high in trafficking activity. But one of the things that I've seen, and going all across the country, tiny towns in New Mexico that took me 5 hours to drive to from the airport, to small places in Iowa and Mississippi and Louisiana, and literally just kind of all 4 corners of the country, is that trafficking is a national problem. And I think what ends up happening is that once a city has a cadre of advocates and experts and people willing to call out the problem and to advocate for some type of accountability resource to go towards the issue, then we start counting. We start counting victims and survivors, and we start saying this is what's happening. But every place that I've been into in this country has a very severe and significant issue with sex trafficking of our kids. And so I think like that's the most important point around, what are the differences and similarities?
Mhm.
For the most part, our public policies are very similar. Our public policies have historically focused on criminalizing and arresting women and girls engaged in selling sex. The vast majority of our towns and cities have very, very small numbers of arrests or interventions when it comes to sex buyers, as Sheri was mentioning earlier, and very high numbers of arrests of women selling sex. And the vast majority of our communities, cities and towns and counties across the country have hardly any dollars going towards prevention and intervention. I think those are the most striking similarities, right? And so it's a national problem. I don't have a lot of international experience or expertise, so I'll definitely leave those questions to people that have lived in professional experience in those areas. But I think it's a national issue. It's all of our problem, and it's really about public policy, narrative change, and resources.
Great.
I can speak a little bit about, I don't have like an in-depth necessarily knowledge of the international comparative law or comparative policy on the issue, but I am right now actually in Northern Ireland, right outside of Belfast, in a city where the Civil War here started, called Derry. And, I think that some of the risk factors are similar here, for example, in Northern Ireland. Insofar as you have kids who are coming from intergenerational poverty, intergenerational trauma, oppression, internalized oppression, specifically from the Catholic community in Northern Ireland that has been, colonized by the British and treated as second-class citizens by the, Irish Protestants who were relocated here specifically to oppress and outnumber them. So yeah, I definitely think that there are some similarities in terms of, just risk factors. If you look at like the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, which is now turned into PACEs study, because they also want to include, obviously like protective factors and factors that deal with resiliency and whatnot. But I do think like a lot of similar issues in terms of vulnerability and risk exist here. The main difference is that Ireland is an extremely white country, and so I would say the divide is not necessarily as informed by race here, but that's because there's only one race here. So instead, it's really informed by the historical legacy of the Troubles here and the Civil War and the colonial influence of the English.
Great. Thank you guys for sharing that. I guess the last question I kind of want to ask before we go to audience questions, to those watching and when we post this, what, from both of your, perspective, what can we do to try to address some of these problems, to raise awareness, to talk about these issues? What do you recommend people do when they leave this program today to help raise awareness of sex trafficking in the United States and the issues that are discussed in this film?
Well, I guess I could just I've got a little bit of a reading list read. And then here's Nikki Jones' book that you can also read. And she's a fabulous woman, and she's an incredible academic and just won like a National Criminology Award for her work. And she's also an advisor to the film and professor at UC Berkeley. There you go. And if you haven't already read this is also an old lady good, but a goodie. I put this under my pillow the night that Trump got elected. I thought maybe if I woke up in the morning, if I had this under my pillow, that things would change, but they didn't. So anyway, And then of course, James Baldwin. And if you go to our website, there's like a whole section called Impact, and it's got tons of research and reports and articles and resources and places that you can donate, including the African American Policy Forum and MISSY and the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland. And it's got lots of resources that you can look at and that you can consider, like, because I do really feel like everybody has a role to play and people need to decide for themselves like how they're going to step up to the plate.
Yeah, I agree.
Options.
Yeah, I would just add, just specifically that prevention work is hugely important. We've been on this, trajectory of doing intervention and crisis response work, which is really important, but we need prevention work, right? We have to believe that it's worth it. We have to believe it's our job to provide supports and education and love and funding and resources for prevention. So convincing funders that Black girls are worth prevention, it's always a challenge. It's hugely important work. And then of course, interventions, crisis response services that are personalized, that are human-centered and culturally competent, not over for any of the service providers that are on, not over programming girls, like a safe space to just be. Sometimes the programming requirements can be too much. You know what I mean? We don't require, I know I don't require all of these things that sometimes programming requires for my own kids. And so I think that the over programming and the making sure that they have to hit this mark and that mark and this mark, it's like they really also just need a safe place to be in a relationships with loving adults and their basic needs met. And of course, education and advocacy, what we're trying to do here today. So thank you again, Katie, for holding this space for us. Any adults that are in this work have to be ready to be ironclad, right? And build strong relationships with survivors, but also be ready to go up against systems and work as a bridge and take the brunt of the impacts of the system at the same time that you're trying to transform it and hold systems accountable, right? I mean, it's like, I know that oftentimes systems are funding us. So it's like fortifying ourselves and being stronger, working together in coalition instead of competition, because trying to transform systems is really difficult, challenging work. And I know that there's folks on here that are already in the work or that are already touching survivors or already doing prevention work. And so shout out to all of you all. And of course, policies that are created with and for survivors, right? And like we've been talking about this entire time is culture change work. Culture change that seeks to address root cause and engage movement work intersectionally and in collaboration, because culture at the end of the day eats policy for breakfast. And so making sure that we're doing policy work and culture work together and at the same time.
Great. We do have a couple questions that I'm going to try and decipher here in the chat. One,
to say one other thing, just to dovetail on what Holly said, is that funders and programmers and social workers and everybody who's involved in systems that touch the lives of young people, you need to trust survivors. You need to trust women. You need to trust girls. They know what they need. They're the expert of their own lives. And they're also, not to say that there can't be like feedback and guidance and insight and all that other stuff, but ultimately, like, just like you're the expert of your own life and what you need and what's healing to you and what's preferential to you and what's sacred to you, like, survivors need to also have the space to define for themselves what is sacred, what does healing look like, how do we define safety, need to be involved, and who needs to stay out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, both of you. One question from the audience, and I don't know, if you can address it, but to what degree have Black male activists been involved and the advocacy work of child sex trafficking?
Well, some of the most brilliant and incredible men that I've had the opportunity to learn from are Black men, and in particular, Black queer men. I mean, the social workers that I was mentored by, you know, throughout my life and in the movement work, were, I would say, like 50% were just, you know, loving, stable, humanizing, brilliant, creative Black men. And I'm so indebted in particular to Brad Kelly and Brian Bob and all the folks that I got the chance to work with and be mentored by. Yeah, so that's what I would say to that in terms of my own personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that, as I said earlier, the trafficking movement for the last 20 years that I've been involved in it has largely been run by white feminists. I mean, it's just, it really has been. I'm just going to be honest, right? It's been like other gender-based violence work in this country. White feminists tend to get funding. Gender-based violence organizations run by white women get money. And so the trafficking movement has been largely influenced by white feminists. And so it's a great question. And I think that we need to just uplift survivor voice and marginalized community voice in the movement in general. And yes, Black men are welcome. You know, everyone's welcome. I really truly believe in, you know, cross racial movement work. But I think like the exclusionary kind of feminism that has happened in the gender-based violence movement over the years is really harmful, and it doesn't lead to solutions that actually keep people safe. So yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. I feel like we talk about this a lot in a lot of our topics, and I feel like some things would be a lot better if white women, myself included, I you know, identify as a white woman, if we just learn to not center ourselves in these conversations as much and uplift the voices. So that's an incredibly important point, I think. One question I feel like is simple. Is All In for Justice a 501c3?
We are in the process of obtaining our fiscal sponsorship. And so by the first week of May, we will have a fiscal sponsor, fingers crossed, and we will be able to receive donations and start writing grants and line up our team of founding donors. We're looking for basically 10 founding donors to help us start our organization and become, you know, have some financial security. And that would be like 10 founding donors who are able to each come in at around $50,000 to $100,000 per individual. So yeah, that's our vision right now.
Awesome. All right, and the last question I'm pulling from the chat, which I think is an incredibly interesting one. Many young boys and men are deepening and actively desensitizing their perversions. Sorry. I tend to view it in a muscle memory kind of way. How can we align with artists such as, say, Cardi B, to reflect strength and enjoyable, consensual, grown experiences, while still honoring that many of us have a modest, protective attitude?
I don't really think that's in our purview. I think people need to do what they feel comfortable with. I don't really think we're like there to answer like deep personal questions about people's love lives. I think, you know, whatever two consenting and informed adults can do, like who are over the age of 18 and like, you know, where there's no like serious power discrepancy financially, emotionally, or otherwise. Like, I don't really have much to say about it.
All right. Well, with that, I think I want to give you guys an opportunity. Is there anything else that you would like to say that we haven't got a chance to touch on tonight, or anything that you would like, you know, to leave our audience with? I know, to just to let the audience know, Sarah's sharing all the links from the books Sheri's mentioned, the Still I Rise film website, so you can interact with the things mentioned tonight and also watch the film. But anything else you would like to leave us with, guys?
I just wanted to say thank you to all the people who helped support and fund the film. You know, Jamel Perkins was our biggest funder. The Berkeley Film Foundation gave us several grants. We had funding from Elizabeth Rosner. We had funding from Ruth Harnish's foundation, you know, Awesome Without Borders. We had a pretty considerable amount of funding from PricewaterhouseCoopers, surprisingly, and Danny Wallace, who heads up their tech division there. PwC gave us a grant from their charitable foundation. We got funding from Leiden Negrete. We got funding from Leida Sensores. So just, you know, I know I'm forgetting like probably many people who funded and supported and loved on and helped us to accomplish this, including James Grissom. Hi, James. You're graduating from USC soon. We love you. We're going to be with you soon. Yeah, so just to say thank you and really appreciate like that in many ways this was a team effort. And you know, thank you to DJ Johnson, who is a professor of film at USC, who helped guide me throughout this whole process. Thank you to John Nutt, who was my film guru and mentor. And thank you to Holly Joshi for like trusting me and like, you know, helping me build a beautiful film and a wonderful friendship. Thank you to Leah Albright Bird for also trusting me with her story. And, you know, and I really felt like a very sacred trust with Holly and with Leah in particular. And, you know, yeah, I guess I just feel really like humbled and honored to be in the company of such amazing women and a few men.
All right. Well,
I also want to thank my husband, Rory Duffy, who is the executive producer, who helped make all of this happen. So thank you, Rory.
all right. Well, thank you guys. I know you both, you know, we're in Eastern time zone. You guys are not. So you're both in, you know, we got UK, Ireland time zone, and California.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, the end of your day, to have this conversation with us here tonight. I very much appreciate it. It's being recorded, so it'll be posted. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us. Our next virtual conversation is May 11th at 6 p.m. And it'll be about revisiting Black Wall Street. So for, you know, all of our program updates to donate, go to freedomcenter.org. Otherwise, thank you guys. Sheri's showing some books. All of these are on their website.
You guys have more interesting things to say than I do, for real.
Very great books.
Thanks everyone for coming out. Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you to the Freedom Center for having us.
Thanks.